Let me start by saying good afternoon and welcoming all of you to Regents Hall on the campus of Loyola University's near North Side campus for an event that I hope you're watching on our website, bettergov.org, and to all the people in the auditorium, thanks for joining us. My name is Andy Shaw, and I spent a lot of years in front of cameras for NBC and ABC, but this is my first time in front of cameras for a live streaming event. It's also the first live streaming event we've done at the Better Government Association, and it's a real exciting moment for a journalistic dinosaur like me to be thrust into the new age of digital communications, to do something that's going to become a bigger and bigger part of what we do at the BGA, as it has been for virtually everyone in journalism. I'm the president and CEO of the Better Government Association, which believes sincerely that better government is our right, it's their responsibility, and if we all do our jobs well, it can actually become a reality. And one of the cornerstones of the campaign for better government is investigations. Investigative reporting, which results in the telling of stories that wouldn't be told without the digging and the scraping and the FOIA filings, and then to get up and talk about the changes that should result from what we find. Regular journalists tell the stories. Their editorial pages sometimes push change. At the BGA, we put both in one place. We tell stories with media partners and sometimes without, on our website and in publications and on the air. And then we propose changes, because you cannot move the good government ball forward unless you propose along with disclose. And as I said, investigations are the cornerstone of what the BGA has always done, and it's one of the proudest parts of the journalistic tradition here in Chicago. Investigations are, of course, changing dramatically in terms of platforms and storytelling techniques, and this is one of our new formats. A couple of quick thank yous before we begin. I want to thank Ralph Brasseth from the Communications Department at Loyola, who's manning one of the cameras here, but has spent the last couple of weeks making this possible for us. We're extraordinarily grateful. Thank you, Ralph. Don Hyder, the Dean of the Loyola School of Communications, is also here. I want to thank from my staff, Jessica Curry and Saul Lieberman, who worked tirelessly to make this happen. And a final thank you is to Steve Miller, a board member at the BGA and a one-man technology committee right now, who gave us a grant to enable us to do this as we move into the digital age of good government watchdog advocacy. One final note, a panel member was supposed to be an old colleague of mine at ABC, Brian Ross, their chief investigative reporter and one of the best in the country. Brian ran into a small problem. There seems to have been a big incident in the Middle East over the weekend, which resulted in the death of a terrorist whose name I can't recall. And as a result, Brian, like any good reporter, is on the story, which is where he should be. The aftermath of the story is almost as big as the actual story itself and requires the best skills in the business, which is why there is no way ABC was letting Brian come to Chicago. We'll have him out another time. So he's going to be ably and aptly and capably replaced by our partner and friend and colleague, Dane Placko of Fox News. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, who is the Crain Chicago business anchor and reporter, former television reporter, someone with whom I've had a lot of opportunities to talk about good government issues on her Crain's broadcast. Lisa Leiter, it's all yours, girl. Take it away.
Thank you all for coming. We have such a great panel. I just want to spend a few moments telling you about them before we begin. Immediately sitting here to my right is Bob Herguth. He's with the Better Government Association as the editor of investigations, and he oversees investigative projects within the organization and also in collaboration with other media. He's a former assignment editor, assistant metro editor, and reporter at the Sun-Times, and the former managing editor of the Milwaukee Business Journal. And he's also contributed to several publications, including my own at Crain Chicago Business. And also he launched his own online media company, bit of an entrepreneur last year, called Niche Chicago News Corp, which operates several beat-specific news websites. And he's also an adjunct professor here at Loyola. And next to Bob, we have Brian Boyer. And Brian's what you would call, I would say what he calls himself, a self-described hacker journalist. and he's helping the paper get to new levels of computer-assisted reporting and reader interactivity. Boyer's team has built online programs to do such things like help families find the headstones of loved ones after cemetery caretakers double-sold plots, and he's also built an application as well to help parents compare schools. So he'll have a lot to tell us about computer-assisted reporting. And then we have Natalie Moore. She's the reporter for WBEZ's Southside Bureau in Englewood, and she covers news and issues in that community. And prior to joining WBEZ in May 2007, Natalie was a City Hall reporter for the Detroit News. And she's also been an education reporter for the St. Paul Pioneer Press and the Associated Press in Jerusalem. And next we have Rick Tulsky. He is the director of Medill's Watchdog and Accountability Initiative. And he has previously worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where he and two other reporters won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about flaws in the local court system, one of more than 24 national awards that Rick has won. He's authored projects at the Los Angeles Times and also at the San Jose Mercury News that also became finalists for a Pulitzer. He's previously taught at the University of Pennsylvania and also was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. And finally, we have Dane Placko. Thank you for filling in at the last minute, Dane. Dane is an investigative reporter for Fox Chicago News, and he began his career in broadcasting at WHO Radio and TV in Des Moines. And after a brief stop in Milwaukee, Dane returned home to Chicago and Fox News in 1992, where he has received several Emmy Awards for his spot news reporting and writing. So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. And I think I'd like to begin just by asking a really general question, which is, how has our 24-hour news cycle that we're all so attached to changed the way you do your investigative reporting? It's a very broad question, but hopefully you all can provide some specific anecdotes of how investigative reporting has changed for you. And I'll open it up to whoever would like to begin.
Oh, I'll go. What the heck?
Thank you.
So from my point of view, what I tend to do are long studies of systemic problems. And what's happened to the news cycles in my world is twofold. One is there are far fewer resources at a newspaper or broadcast station to do this, so fewer people spending long, luxurious times getting to the heart of stories. And the resources of the newsroom outside of people, just all the emphasis when they hire, when they do stuff, it's all quick, quick, quick. I like to think of myself as the opposite of quick.
I think that more of us in newsrooms are expected to incorporate investigative reporting in our daily jobs, because you're probably seeing fewer investigative units. Because the newsroom has changed, you don't have the luxury of having people who can spend 6, 9 months, a year working on one project. So in some ways it's good that more of us are learning these tricks, we're getting some of the training. In some newsrooms I've worked in, reporters on their own volition want to incorporate this in their regular beat reporting. So if you're an education reporter, you know, you can do this yourself. You don't have to have the investigative team do those kind of stories.
And this might be sort of basic, obviously, for a lot of folks, but it used to be just you do a story and it comes out in the morning paper or on the 10 o'clock news, and now, with the help of our web editor, Saul, we also plot out when to maybe release something when, you know, more people are online and paying attention to things. So there's timing is more of an issue.
We've seen it on the TV side. I do longer form pieces, so I'm not trying to constantly feed the monster throughout the day, but occasionally we'll look at the news flow, the news cycle through the day, and we know the other stations finish up their newscasts at 6:30. So at 6:45, if I have a really good story we want to get out there and get some buzz building about, we'll pop it on the web at 6:45, 7 o'clock and see if we can't, you know, get a little hit in the 9 o'clock ratings based on people who know about, have seen the web presence.
I mean, one thing the web gives us is the sort of opportunity to meet people at any time, but also anywhere. I mean, along with investigative work, we do a lot of elections work on our team. And just as we were beginning to launch a mobile-friendly election website, there was a Pew report release that said people are getting their election-related information more over mobile, and we saw analytics that absolutely tracked that. We had over 10% of our traffic was coming from mobile readers, which is kind of absurd for the Chicago Tribune. It's just it's much higher than our usual mobile traffic. So.
And some of you talked about resources. I mean, all of us who are working journalists are having to do more with less time and less money. Do you think that the lack of resources that are available to journalists today impact the kind of investigative journalism that they're doing? I mean, are we doing as good investigation journalism today as we were 20 years ago? Who wants to take that one?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I mean, one media partner that we work with at the BGA really kind of, maybe more than one, but focuses more on quick hit stuff. They have to get it out. They have ratings to satisfy and viewers to satisfy and all that. And so things are maybe not as they were, but maybe we're a little bit of, at the BGA, a little bit more unusual in that, we're growing and we're adding staff, so we're trying to kind of take dual tracks where we do the quicker hits and the mid-level stories and also focus on some of the longer-term stuff. So I don't think it's totally disappeared.
The model has changed.
I mean, there are definitely fewer resources. I marvel at stories. I used to work with Walter Jacobson when he was an anchor at our place, and Walter would tell stories about the glory days at Channel 2 back in the 70s and 80s when he had a team, not just one, but a team of producers helping him build stories and do his perspectives. And nowadays, you're lucky as an investigative reporter if you have even one producer, and even that person may be tasked to other jobs within the newsroom. So it is tougher to build the big picture stories, the stories that require lots of FOIAs and lots of data crunching and lots of analysis. Because you have to feed the monster, as I said before, and you want to get on at least a couple times a week. So what I try to do is I try to find some smaller stories that I know I can turn and get on the air, and then have one or two really big projects going on at the same time. But I think the big picture stories, the really hard-hitting, fundamentally important stories are tougher to do these days because of the lack of resources. And
FOIA, for anybody who doesn't know, is Freedom of Information Act. So just want to explain that, just in case there's anybody out there that doesn't know. Do you all think that investigative journalism still sells? From a news consumer perspective, do you feel that they're looking for these types of projects?
I absolutely think so, because of this 24-hour news cycle and the blogs and the cacophony of news or personalities or content, because all of it's not news that we're getting. I think for journalists to differentiate ourselves, we have the training to do investigative work, and that's not knocking people who may blog or have a niche area that they cover. However, this is where we can really shine, and I think these big projects, which can have a longer life on the web and other visual components, I think that's what's going to sustain our jobs, making us stand out from the rest of the white noise that's out there in the media landscape.
Anybody else want to add on that?
I just think that you have to, if you tap a nerve, you tap a nerve. And if it's a good story, I think people will read it. We did a story with the Daily Herald a couple of months ago about a suburban politician whose household stands to gain, was it 4 or 5 pensions, public sector pensions. Same time he's talking about cutting pensions for firefighters in his own town. And it got huge attention. We did, it wasn't the most complicated investigative piece, but it took a lot of, fact checking, a lot of record searching and whatnot, and some interviewing. And it really touched a nerve with people. And there were, 100 or 200 comments on the Daily Herald site, which for a lot of their stories, I think was a lot. And we got just a lot of buzz off it. So I think if you touch a nerve, people are going to respond and react, and then the stories kind of ripple from there.
As a reporter, investigative reporter, having the web, I imagine, to have those comments must change your process as well, because you're probably getting information and story ideas to further the investigation from that as well. Do you use those tools?
Yeah, absolutely. We did, reading the comments, it was something I never really, sounds dumb, but I never really thought to do until a few years ago on a story that's online. I started reading them, and there are usually the people that tune in there. I mean, there's a lot of wackos, but there also are a lot of good tips. And actually, on one of these stories relating to Oak Brook, it's one of the comments related to, basically parlayed into another story. So, and that's not unusual at all.
And Brian, we were talking before the panel began about the web and how someone like Dane has to deal with time constraints on the stories that he has, and obviously has done a tremendous amount of reporting and fact gathering that will frankly never go on air, right?
Right.
And you were saying that you are able to use the web to basically dump all this data on there for the public to see and use as they see fit.
Yeah, part of our sort of team religion is to always show your work. And so with any piece that we work with, the entire data set that drove the reporting and potentially drives the application or whatever it was we built is available for anyone to grab, to repurpose and build something else with. But also, like Bob was saying, not just with the comments, but that giving people the full set of information lets people find their own sort of personal context in it. We had a story about city council expenses a year ago, where there was a handful of anecdotes that were written in the story were interesting, but readers were actually finding potentially more interesting stories and emailing us about it because they live in that ward and they know that person and they know that building and they could say maybe more than we could about it, and it turned into other stories.
Well, like a kind of a citizen journalism.
Or just citizen tip line.
Mm-hmm,
But give inquisitive readers the information and let them find things in it.
Okay. Rick, would you say some of the stories that you've written over the years, how do you think that today's news cycle, how would they have changed? I mean, what do you think?
Well, what's changed is how often news organizations invest in doing it. I judge contests and see a lot of work that's done around the country, and there's still amazing journalism being done in a lot of places, but where places used to invest in 5 projects a year, now they do 1 and take a lot of pride in that. And it's a harder process for everyone involved, and for reporters in a lot of newsrooms, they feel pressure to produce. They are afraid to get too deep into a project because they're afraid they're not satisfying their bosses and will be stuck in the next set of layoffs. And so I don't think it's that the quality is less. I think it's that the quantity is less.
What stories do you think aren't being told right now?
Yeah.
Sure, everyone has an opinion on that, but.
I think where we see the greatest decline is in outlying areas. The Chicago Tribune will still do a great job in the city, but it's cut back in bureaus everywhere, less suburban coverage. The suburban coverage that there is, there's still resources there, but it's more immediate, daily kinds of stuff. And I think, each editor decides for him or herself where you make the cutbacks, but wherever they make them, that's where we get hurt.
I think there's less city coverage. I think that city institutions are covered, like cops, courts, and schools. I think a lack of what we're seeing is in neighborhoods. And I cover the South Side. I have a counterpart who covers the West Side and is based in Humboldt Park, and then someone in Rogers Park in the Northwest Indiana. I've worked in many mediums. I don't know of any bureaus that are located in cities. I've worked in suburban bureaus. So, what we're able to do is do this void because there's not as much local news, again, outside of the institutions.
Well, I mean, I think it's true that there are fewer investigative reporters in the Chicago area or Illinois, but I think there's more investigative reporting than a lot of people probably realize. Maybe not always good or great, but a lot of these little local community online publications or even print publications there are some sprouting up. I mean, you look at your patch.com, even Jack Ryan, the former U.S. Senate candidate, has become a kind of a mini media mogul. He's opening papers on the North Shore. And I'm not saying that they're filled with investigative reporting, they're not, but you know, a lot of the beat reporters, if they're good and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're doing at least some level of investigative reporting anyway. So maybe it's very localized, but there is probably more than people realize.
I think we saw a great little example of some of the impact on the resources, at least at the newspapers and local television stations, within the past year and a half with the Scott Lee Cohen case. He got into the race. And in years past, I think when resources were a little bigger, every shop in town would have vetted very carefully the backgrounds of all the candidates, and that clearly wasn't done in this case, even though he spoke about it very casually and to, I think, one person at the time, and then it just disappeared until he became a factor in the race, and that story suddenly blew up after he'd won, and everybody's like, well, where was the reporting on this? Why didn't we know about this sooner? Well, we just don't have the time to do the kind of background checks on every candidate that comes down the pike that we used to be able to do.
How do we address that? I mean, you know, maybe
That's the question.
Well, and is the question, you know, what about partnerships? Obviously, you guys are doing this already, partnering up with local news organizations. Are we going to see more of this, whether it's a nonprofit, organizations like ProPublica, or even corporations doing their own investigative reporting? I mean, how do we deal with that?
Well, I think, you know, BGA and Medill is setting up its own thing, and I think you are seeing all around the country more places filling the void as best they can. You know, one organization in a city or two organizations in a city or three organizations in the city even is not the same as every news outlet doing it for themselves. There's something really healthy about competition. And, you know, Chicago's still blessed with 2 newspapers and several TV outlets that love to be competitive, and that's a good thing. And, they're, you know, while they're competitive, there's also the pressure because of the news cycle to get it out quickly and not spend the time. So it cuts both ways, I think.
But I do think we're going to see more partnerships on the national level. You see ProPublica, New York Times, NPR doing things. On the local level, WBEZ, it's not anything formalized, but I've partnered with the Chicago Reporter. Our education reporter has partnered with Catalyst, and both of those are nonprofit investigative magazines that do amazing work. Their readership isn't as large as our listenership, so if you partner and then have the web element that's there, then you get a bigger impact. So I think we're going to be seeing more of those because of the resources shrinking. How can we maximize what resources we do have? And I think that's going to continue with partnerships.
You mentioned impact, Natalie, and I'm wondering how all of you currently or in the past have measured the impact of your stories. Obviously, you know, Bob, you talked about comments on the website. I'm sure that's one way, but how else are you measuring the impact of your stories?
Well, I mean, we're seeing results in some respects. We're seeing people resign. I mean, these are kind of more of our shorter term to mid-term stories, but we have a list somewhere of kind of the results that we've gotten in our various stories. On some occasions, you know, people will resign after we humiliate them into something, you know, from government. And you did what? And or we'll see policy changes. This being Chicago, a lot of them are cosmetic, and we want and seek greater impact. But you know, sometimes, given where we are, moving the ball even a few inches or a few feet is victory. So we just keep plugging ahead.
When you look at impact, you know, what Brian said about giving people tools, it's not just getting resignations of officials, it's getting people aware and in positions so that you've got an informed electorate. And I think all the things that are going on with all of the media, that's one of the goals we all have.
Yeah, just to piggyback on something that was said earlier about, you know, talking about the landscape and whatnot. I think that these are, in the end, when we talk about, well, resources are dwindling, money's tight in media, I think still we're talking about choices made by media owners and operators. a lot of these media outlets are still making money. They're definitely not making as much money as they were. Some of them are still making quite a bit of money, and, okay, maybe they have to cut back for shareholders for whatever reason, but I would point out that Chicago Sun-Times, where I used to work, emerged from bankruptcy, always seems on thin ice financially, and yet they still commit to good, solid investigative reporting. And, Tim Novak and Chris Fusco are basically full-time investigative reporters, and they do a great job. And for local reporting, basically for Investigative Project, they just won, not them, but two other reporters, won a Pulitzer. So, I mean, the Sun-Times would be very easy to scale back and say, oh, we don't have the money, we got to, put it into, the day-to-day stuff, but they've made a choice, and pretty much every outlet is making a choice by cutting back on this, by saying it's not a priority. So I just think that should put into perspective.
What about access to information? I mean, you mentioned Freedom of Information Act, and obviously the web has opened up a lot of opportunity for investigative reporters. I know, Natalie, you have some things to say about access to documents and access to information. Can you guys talk about, how much of a challenge that is as you start your process?
Illinois is a challenge. We do not have very open government here. I've worked in other states and got information much more freely. To get a medical examiner's report, I had to go through the public access counselor, and I still didn't get it. And I couldn't believe I was denied a medical examiner's report. So Lisa Madigan hired a public access counselor within her office, and part of it was to educate people around the state, like, you just can't tell people no. And if you tell them no, you have to cite the law and give a reason. And some people just think, well, I don't have to give this to you. Like, they think it's private, and it's not. Right now, we're working with the public access counselor again to get some information, and I just think there's some sort of tension. And the thing is, what we're asking for wouldn't even hurt that agency. Not that it's our job to protect them, but we aren't even going after them. That's not what the data we want would do. But there's still they're still very nervous, and that comes across in their interaction with us. Are you going to do something bad? And it does. I mean, even if that doesn't matter. Like, the law is the law. So even when we're told no or told you can't have certain parts, we often have to get that public access counselor to come in. I've had the public access counselor write letters when they don't even follow the law and give you, you have to, when you fill out a FOIA, they have to respond to you in so many days. And if they need extra time, they have to respond in so many days. And it's a slippery slope if they think, oh, well, I work with you, I can get that extra day and not tell you about it. So it's an uphill battle. I mean, that's the best way I can put it, but it doesn't deter us from trying to get that information. And I would say the public access counselor is helpful in educating other entities around the state and also interpreting the law for us so we can get better access.
And it kind of feeds into what we were just talking about before about resources, and with resources as tight as they are, it's a constant frustration to have to, I mean, sometimes it seems like more than half the battle is just getting your hands on the documents in the first place, getting your hands on the information. By way of example, we're working on a story for tonight, a partnership story with the Better Government Association about Park District and the use of some credit cards. And when did we send out the FOIA on that initially? Two and a half months ago, quite some time ago. And they sent us some information, and some of it was redacted, and we had to go back to them. And I mean, we are literally still today in conversation with their PR people to nail down some of the details, and the story is airing tonight. I mean, that just shouldn't be.
When I was at the Sun-Times, I requested, in the Sun-Times, even though I just complimented them, they're also notoriously cheap too on the legal front, and I had requested through FOIA documents, police reports, basically a breakdown of crime by every L station. And it took them 7 months, what they should have given me in 7 days, business days, 7 months to give me something, and it wasn't even what I asked for, because they knew we weren't going to sue. And that's like not even that unusual, 7 months. I mean, the police department is just notorious for just not turning over what they need to turn over. One good news, since I've kind of come over here to the BGA, we have such a supportive board of directors that includes a lot of attorneys, and that will offer up somebody pro bono to go to bat for us. So not only are we able to push back now on government and do it increasingly, we've got at least one lawsuit right now against the police department, and for a separate situation. But also we found that now in this kind of dwindling resource era in the media landscape, other media partners are coming to us, looking to partner for us, knowing that they're probably going to get shoved back from some governmental agency, and knowing that maybe we can then go to bat on the legal front if we have to. So I think also on that dynamic, you know, things are kind of shifting, not only for us, but in the market as a whole.
Lawyers are very, very expensive, and if you want to fight for a FOIA, it can sometimes be tough to get your corporate parent to sign off on something that could cost thousands of dollars. And so that's why the BGA has been an enormous resource for us, because the story you speak of was one that we were working on together regarding a police detail for a certain alderman, which they wouldn't turn over any information. Yeah, well, come up to us afterwards, we'll tell you.
Have you ever not been able to get a story done because you couldn't get the FOIA fight that you wanted?
I don't know if there's ever a story that I haven't gotten on the air. There's certainly stories we have gotten on the air that I felt were incomplete to some degree, or could have been better stories if we'd had legitimate cooperation from the agency we were looking at.
Mm-hmm. Brian, you're dealing with kind of a different aspect of this in terms of information, and you're sort of given it and how to present it, how to package it in such a way that's going to be useful, because there might be a database online that someone is interested in, but they may not know how to navigate it. And that's part of the process that your investigative team works with. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the biggest challenges that you faced? It may not be the access to the information, it may be in the presentation of the information.
Well, access is certainly a problem, and our team was actually just involved with a big story about the PAC counselor. But the it's presentation's hard because you can put a spreadsheet up there, but we're trying to tell a story with the data. We're trying to give people an opportunity to find their own personal meaning in this information, and so our team, that's too wonky, but our team engages in what we call user-centric design. So we think really specifically, ask ourselves specific questions about who's our audience, what are their needs, what specific people are we addressing this to, and how can we make it, when they pick up the paper and they read a 3-day investigation and they're afraid, they're worried about their family members or whoever's being impacted, they can go and they can find their own meaning in this data. So.
Okay. One thing I wanted to talk about too is the notion of the scoop. We were talking about that before we walked up here. How do you deal with that? If you're working on something for a very long time, but you feel that there's something that needs to get out there or will get out there, frankly, whether it's on Twitter or on somebody's blog or something, how are you balancing the need to feed your publication or organization's needs in terms of an investigative sense, but also, reporting those tidbits, those nuggets of information as you go along that might leak out otherwise? Anybody have to deal with that?
I've taken a different view on scoops. At WBEZ, we have the luxury of being, we have news spots, and news spots are about 60 seconds to fill our newscast. But for reporters like me, they want longer, the NPR-esque, long-form journalism. So they want more of that from me and some of my colleagues, which isn't always investigative. Most times it isn't, but the long, thoughtful pieces versus the quick hits. We actually fight to get those quick hit stories, so we're covering our beat, et cetera. However, okay, I just lost my train of thought. What was the
about
the
balancing
sorry,
the investigation with getting little nuggets of news out there?
I think because of the 24-hour news cycle, a scoop lasts about 5 minutes now. You don't take much glory in it, like if it's breaking news. And the one example that I like to give, when Michael Jackson was presumed dead, actually I was on the air with Richard Steele doing Pledge Drive, and Mel Ballara was in the other studio saying, they're calling Michael Jackson, but we're not going to call it. And everybody's texting me, Michael Jackson's dead, Michael Jackson's dead. And I'm like, well, no, he hasn't been called. Well, TMZ is calling it. Well, TMZ was right. But imagine the egg on your face If CNN, LA, I mean, we didn't call it, no one called it till the LA Times called it. So what was it, like a half hour later? Big deal. If that had been wrong in the mainstream media, we're supposed to be much more credible. If we had called Michael Jackson and he had not been dead, that just would have been, I think, a horrendous moment for journalism at that time. So when I think about scoops, I think about it doesn't really last that long because of Twitter, Facebook, internet. AP will pick it up. So that's not as much of a priority. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't be competitive or try to get the stories out there, but this idea of I have to be first, I have to be first, I think that accuracy should trump that idea of being first.
Well, can I just congratulate Natalie in two ways she's shown herself to be an old-fashioned reporter. One is the idea of getting it right, mattering more. And the other is she lost her train of thought when there was a siren outside.
That's so embarrassing.
Well, Dane, do you, I mean, when you're working on a longer investigation, do you do stories in pieces? In other words, would you maybe, if you had a really good nugget of what you would envision
if
a
there's
longer...
something that's just white hot and you know you've got it nailed down, you want to get it on the air as quickly as possible and maybe, suss out some of the details later. But I am unabashedly a fan of scoops. I mean, you love it when it happens for you, and it drives you nuts when you see somebody, working for the competitor getting one. And I think in a way, it's what drives a lot of what we do. It's that sort of primitive need to be the first to have a certain piece of information or fit the pieces together and to know something that other people don't know. I mean, that's like crack cocaine for journalists. It really is. And it does drive a lot of the stories we do. Is you want to dig something up that nobody knows, and you want to make a splash with it. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I'm going to come out as anti-scoop. I mean, when you come up with information that nobody knows, and you put it on the television, and then you've got about 30 seconds, and then it's on every website. Right? It's to me, it's not really about having it first, it's having it best, or having the most reach with it, or and the idea that it really bothers me. I mean, I'm new to the industry, but it bothers me when one news organization runs a story and then maybe we won't, or another competing organization wouldn't report the same thing, because it's about informing our audience, and a Tribune reader might not be an easy listener, right? And so it's not at all redundant, and besides, we're in an extremely information redundant age, so just report it.
But I would just add, I think also part of what we're talking about is the distinction between maybe breaking news, scoops, which are kind of like a dime a dozen, or higher impact scoops, where maybe you're the only one who can confirm something. So yeah, all these other media outlets pick it up and all these bloggers pick it up, but they still give you credit. So there's still that impact there, still that name recognition, still that the word still spreads with the credit to the organization that broke it to begin with. And I agree with Dane. It's what motivates us all, or many of us, competition, and take that out of the equation, and it's kind of like, why are some of us here?
But you're exactly right. There are different kinds of stories. Early on, when I worked in Philadelphia, I worked for this genius editor named Gene Roberts, who taught us all things by speaking in this very oblique way, and we were often left to decipher what it was he meant. And one of the things he always used to say to us was he wanted us to zig rather zag. And what it turned out he meant by that was, you're not going to find the best stories by going to the press conference where 2,000 people are and worrying about the story where everybody else is. That where the press can do its best job and most important work is to cover the things that nobody else is paying attention to. And so if those are the places you spend your time, you're going to have the scoop in the end because nobody else is there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you feel like you are getting the credit for the investigative journalism that you're doing once it's out there? Do you think that as it's retweeted and posted on Facebook and picked up and re-reported, that the scoop or the hard work that you've been doing for so long has been diluted because maybe the attribution isn't always there? I mean, some story that comes to mind for me was the homeless man that was found by the Columbus Dispatch photographer, who just thought to stop, and then, the story exploded, and, they weren't really given all that much credit.
No, but you still remember who did it.
Well, I do because I'm a journalist, but I'm not sure everybody else does.
It's not about the ego. It's really about, knowing that you accomplished something.
Right.
You pulled something off, and you, in a competitive environment, you got something that nobody else. Whether it's out all over the web in 5 minutes, that's fine. In fact, that's good because it tells you, yeah, hey, other people would have loved to have had that story. I got it first.
Right.
But there is a lot of thievery at the same time. There's a lot of thievery. I mean, a lot of the TV stations, when I was at the Sun-Times, the joke was, they sit there and read their newscasts in the morning, and it'd be everything from the papers. They just rip and read, and there was no credit given. And still that's the case. And, so that still happens.
But that's how it's going to be, right? So sometimes writes a story. Is it thievery when I post a comment about it on my Facebook wall? No. Probably not. But is my Facebook wall a media source for a couple hundred people? Yes. Right? I'm not a professional journalist on my Facebook wall. But so rewriting the story, it just whether or not it's thievery maybe is unimportant. It just is. It's the way things are going to be. And people, sometimes you'll get links back if you do really great work and you have the best presentation of the story. But otherwise, no.
Well, Brian, maybe we could expand on something else we were talking about earlier in regards to this is data sharing, and how, as someone who's new to the profession, was sort of struck by news organizations' lack of willingness to do that. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I am. So I've been in journalism for 2 years, I came into this field assuming that journalists were jealous with their data. I said, why isn't the data online? When I read the story, why can't I find the spreadsheet? And I was just happy to find out that they weren't. I've met a few that are, but the vast majority of folks really want to share the information and have up until now been lacking the tools. And what's fun about this sort of era of journalism is that there are amazing tools now for it. We were one of the first partners to work with a piece of software called Document Cloud, where we put not just a couple of documents from the last Blue Wavish trial, we put all of them on. Every single document submitted to evidence was online, including paired with accompanying audio track, which made it a lot more fun. And so it's kind of a tremendous age for that. Like we have the opportunity now to provide sort of infinite depth of context to these stories, whereas what you can't do in print or on broadcast.
And Rick, I'm curious what you think about this, because obviously, the public can be more involved now in an investigative process than perhaps it was when you were writing some of your pieces at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and how that changes the process.
I think getting information in the hands of the public is good. The last thing I did at the Mercury News before I came here, we went through every sponsored bill for the last 2 sessions of the legislature, showed who the outside sponsor was that had written and promoted the bill, who the legislator was, who had introduced it, and we put the whole thing online, making it easy for people to look up any legislator they wanted. And interestingly, the LA Weekly picked it up, credited us, and did it for the LA legislator specifically, doing a story called The Worst Legislator in LA. So, I'm familiar and have absolutely no problem with sharing data. To me, the danger is that we are becoming a society that is sort of swimming in data without enough people explaining what it means and how to use it and how to make sense out of it. Right. Yeah. And that's what our job is, I think.
I was going to say also, at the BGA, what we did, we started, I think last year, citizen journalism program, Citizen Watchdogs, where we have these sessions where we train people in the art of FOIA, Open Meetings Act, and just give them some of the basics and say, if you want to go out there and watch your government, go for it. And if you want to blog for us, feel free. And it's had some success, and it's provided some, even if it hasn't provided maybe as many blog entries always as we wanted. It's also provided some stories for us, some tips. So we're trying to, you know, there are some imperfections to it, but I think engaging the citizenry is something that's going to keep happening. I think that's part of the future. And if not, them doing investigative work themselves, which again, I think, you know, does have some hazards, but also some positives. Certainly, opening that line of communication can provide for more tips and good story ideas.
Yeah, I mean, regarding, you know, I applaud providing citizen journalism platforms. It's awesome. But also there's, you know, one of the nice things about just giving out the data is there are a lot more people who will dig through the data, write a FOIA, do that work, than who will then take the next step and write a narrative story, right? So let's enable those people to just go that far.
Let me go back to Gene Roberts and another one of the things he taught us in Philadelphia. He always said, when you come upon something that's newsworthy, the first question we were always trained to ask was, is it an isolated case or is it part of a pattern? Because if you have a police officer who beat somebody, that's always a good story. But if you bother to go back and look up and find the officer beat 5 people over a period of time, that becomes a very good story. And if you go back further and find 5 officers beat 25 people, now you've got great journalism. And I think one of the things that when you give the data out, people aren't necessarily looking for the systemic, they're looking for their own little world. And one of the important things we can still do as journalists that hopefully will always have a place is to look for the systemic abuses that occur.
Okay, well, I think I'd like to take questions from the audience now. Enough of my questions. Let's hear what's on your minds. Yes?
This sort of goes to the comment about being right and taking the time to do things, but why does the media give credibility to people who say, I heard that, and then they get the idea promoted widely, be it electronically, print, or television?
When you say give credibility to somebody who say, I heard that, is it somebody in public life or not? Because, well, I mean, one of the problems is I'm amazed at more and more how we have officials saying things that are even beyond spinning. They're just saying things, whether it's birthers or whatever it is. And once you have public officials saying it, we could have an hour-long debate about what the role is of the media and what's appropriate, you know, and you will have people saying, well, we do that because it's important for people to know their official says things that are crazy. Well, what about all the people who hear it and don't know that?
And I'm not sure what specific examples you're giving, but when I teach, I'm an adjunct at Columbia College, and the first week we talk about the media. Like, let's not use the media as a term because that can encompass film, the New York Times to the National Enquirer. And they're also media personalities versus journalists. So when I hear your comment, I think more about the cable shows where those are not journalists. Those are just talking heads who are spewing rumors, they're inflammatory, you know, they aren't as concerned about facts. So I think you see more of that rather than in the journalism that people like us and our colleagues do.
We have a mic too. If you guys have questions, we'll walk the mic.
Okay, Jessica over here.
My name is Beth Conrad. I'm a professor here at journalism at School of Communication. I'm also the immediate past president of the Chicago Headline Club. When you were talking about access and FOIA, it really struck a nerve. We've just completed the Chicago Headline Club, which is the Society of Professional Journalists chapter here in Chicago, 400 journalists. Hopefully many of you are members. We just completed a survey here of access. Many of you participated on that. And we are now putting together, the survey has been completed. And it's somewhat disturbing, just as you've indicated and you have teased here on your panel as far as access, FOIA. It's supposed to be 5 days that you're supposed to get a return on a FOIA request. That has not happened in many cases. But in the next 3 to 4 weeks, we are putting together the Chicago Headline Club, and hopefully we ask the help for the BGA and anyone else on your panel. We're putting together a forum with Mayor-elect Rahm Emanuel, with Cook County officials, and also with Lisa Madigan's office to try to see if we can try to make some improvement on these access issues and also FOIA requests. Surprisingly, I will tell you the release of the survey will be made in about a week and a half to 2 weeks, but I can tell you one finding that was disturbing. Out of all of the different access problems, the one that had the highest number of complaints was the city of Chicago.
Okay. Yes.
My name's Rachel Goodstein, and I've been involved in a number of what I call citizen good government initiatives. And I'm not surprised that it would be the city of Chicago. And I would say to anyone, if you're interested in getting anything from the Daley administration, tomorrow all I would do is spend time filling out FOIAs, because they will be shredding like crazy. I mean, I was involved with the Megs thing, the No Game Chicago, right now working to preserve the Lathrop homes. So I know groups I've been involved with, and we've talked about that. And the other thing is maybe a question some of you have the answer to, is that the state legislature was working on a new FOIA law that was going to, I think, make it harder. And I've lost track of where that is.
Anybody know anything about that?
Our policy person's been kind of tracking this. I'm not the best person to ask, but I mean, there are, from what I recall, several versions that are sifting around, and nothing's been approved yet. But I do know that there's a lot of pressure coming from municipalities in Illinois to scale back the quote-unquote reforms that were enacted January 1st of 2010, which weren't even that great to begin with.
On the other hand, I did see a release today that the county commissioners are going to take up consideration at their next meeting of something that will require data to go online and more user-friendly. So at least somebody's pretending to try to do something.
Why wasn't that done years ago? You know, I've feasted on the county doing stories over the past few years, and it's just enormously frustrating. You would fill out a FOIA, and for something very simple, just a report or a document, which you knew could be retrieved in an hour if they wanted to, and sometimes you call a source and they'd get it for you in 20 minutes. And if you, they would give you one, they'd take their full 5 days, and they'd send you a letter saying, well, we're going to take a little bit more time, and then another week. And honestly, those contracts and subcontracts and all of that should be online. It's ridiculous that it isn't already there.
Good afternoon. African-American media in Chicago continues to break stories that mainstream media misses. What progress do you think we've made in 2011 as it relates to race and ethnicity in Chicago?
Not much. I mean, we're still pretty segregated. I mean, it's probably gotten better since the last census. I'm saying probably. That's something that we plan to look at. But I mean, we're a very diverse city, but we are diverse in our little enclaves for the most part, I think.
Okay, over here, in here, yes?
Hi, my name's Janie. I'm a graduate student at Medill doing business reporting. And I was just wondering if you had a word to say, do you guys think of financial journalism as a, I guess, good soil for investigation, investigative reporting? And if so, what kind of stories should journalists be tapping into right now?
I would answer that with a resounding yes, but perhaps, Bob, since you've done some work
Yeah,
with Crain's, that you could answer it as well.
Yeah, I mean, investigative reporting is not just, I mean, for us, it really is, at the BGA, it's focused mostly on government. And, but investigative journalism could be anything. It could be in business, it could be on religion, it could be sports, I mean, any topic.
Corporate America, corporate Chicago is probably rife with opportunities for investigative journalism, and not enough is being done, I would say. Yes, ma'am.
You know, you're all saying the same thing that some of us have been saying for a long time. The print and broadcast heads have all committed suicide. At one time, if somebody published something, the Tribune, the Daily News, Sun-Times, any of the papers would publish it. Today, they cheat their subscribers by telling them to get a computer and see it online. They're failing it. Nobody has the backbone to come back and be a real newspaper editor or a broadcast editor. They don't know what the blazes they're doing. That's where those reports usually are.
You have a question out there? Yes, sir.
You're all hiding behind that one.
Good afternoon. I'm actually here from a citizen media platform called Breaking Voices, Evolution of Breaking News, that I launched a year ago. And one of the things that I keep hearing over and over is that the tools exist, but it kind of sounds like it's still in the hands of those that have the power. And really what we're seeing more and more of is the scoop coming directly out of neighborhoods on the micro-local level. So how are some of your companies and brands embracing platforms such as Every Block, that was acquired by MSNBC, iReport, which started 3 years ago, when us allowing any person that has an iPad to generate real-time news into your, the narrative of the story, because it would be great to be able to add that content using geolocation, and that gets you closer to that breaking news or that breaking voice that's coming out of different locations in real time. Because it really sounds like people are overlooking that part of, the action that Twitter, Facebook allows you to have.
Yeah, just this winter we were experimenting, we used the platform called Ushahidi. For the folks who are not familiar with it, it's a sort of a geolocative, crowdsourced information jumbling thing. That first came of age tracking elections in Africa and was sort of a big deal in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti, where people would be able to sort of raise their hand and say, I'm in trouble, and other people will be able to say, I can help, right? There are children trapped, I have a forklift. And so it was a platform that was sort of built to connect first responders in moments of crisis. And the blizzard of 2011 was not an earthquake, but it was a good opportunity for us to sort of try this thing out as a good sort of test run to build the institutional knowledge of using systems like this to not only gather information, connect people to one another so they can help each other out. And it turned out actually that the reporters loved it because we were actually creating stories. People were saying, I'm trapped in my car. There is snow that has been piled over me on Lakeshore Drive. And we talked to that person. So we're trying.
And this is like a little bit, maybe apples to oranges. I think you're speaking more technologically, but in terms of like collaboration on a content level, like with straight reporting, we've had not a lot, but several inquiries just in the past couple months from like patch reporters and some other kind of smaller, kind of growing, hyper-local news outlets wanting to collaborate with us. And we haven't really done much so far with that, but it's something we're seeing more of and hearing more of, and I'm really thinking about, and probably at some point, we'll be doing more of as a larger organization, even though it's hyper-local. But I mean, it all goes back to, we have to kind of know our partners, know who they are, and know their credibility level, because we don't like making mistakes.
Can I say a cautionary note about hyper-local? There's such an information overload in 24/7 world, and everybody wants to get information on that. One of the things I worry about with hyperlocal news is that there isn't anyone making the judgment about should this go out there. And I'm thinking of a pastor perhaps in Gainesville, Florida, who decides to burn a Crain, and the local, hyper-local place puts it on, so the Gainesville paper puts it up and AP picks it up, and suddenly there's deaths in Afghanistan because it's a jihad. I mean, does anybody worry? I worry about everything, but does anybody else worry about, as everybody has a voice and an outlet, that it's not always the best thing?
I think about those things too. Every content producer is not a journalist. And what we do is democratize. We don't need a license. We don't have to have a degree to do it, but there is a certain amount of training and ethics that we have. And that's really important, and that's not to take away from, I think because of all this information, people felt like their voice wasn't getting out there or they needed a different kind of outlet, and that's great. But it's not always journalism, and you don't have an editor reining you in or fact-checking you or saying, well, maybe that's not the best decision to make. So, you know, I just always caution about that. Content does not always equal journalism.
But I think that's also sort of a media education problem, and we need to be teaching media savvy in our schools.
Media literacy.
Literacy, absolutely, in our schools. Yes, there was a Martin Luther King quote that was rampant on Facebook yesterday, completely misinterpreted. But there was also a guy like around the corner from the house in Pakistan talking about the helicopters coming and wondering what was going on.
That's right.
I mean, it's got its pluses and minuses, but it's here to stay. So
there's also an organization called the News Literacy Project that was started by an editor, from a former editor at the LA Times, and it's in Chicago, New York, and DC. And I'm a fellow here in Chicago, and we're not trying to teach middle schoolers to be journalists, but I mean, they grew up, I'm a digital immigrant, they're digital natives. You know, I came along through the time, but I didn't grow up with any of this, but I can speak the language. And for them, like, everything is just out there, and I get students who are so confused. They don't know who to believe, who to trust, where does this information come from? Last week, Twitter killed Al Jarreau. You know, there's you know, and Facebook, it's like trending, and I'm like, everybody, he is not dead. There's no news story, and it was false. And so when you get all these false rumors that come up there, it just really confuses people. So just to echo, news literacy is really, really important, so you are an informed and savvy media consumer.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, although I'm sure we could talk about it for the rest of the afternoon. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. I think they contributed to a great discussion. And also thank you to Loyola University for hosting this event. And thank you all for coming.